Who would have thought that this beautiful, glowing powder would drag an entire city into an endless abyss? This isn't some sci-fi movie. It's a disaster on the level of the Chernobyl disaster. And if you don't watch until the very end, you'll never truly understand just how badly poverty and ignorance can destroy a person's life. The story takes place in Brazil back in 1987. In order to scrape together enough money for a decent pair of soccer shoes, two young men pushed a cart into an abandoned radiation therapy center in Goiás. At first, they were just planning to collect some scrap metal to sell for cash. But deep inside the ruins, they came across a massive and heavy piece of equipment. Jack immediately recognized it. The outer shell was made of lead, which could fetch a really good price at the scrapyard. So they pulled out their tools and started smashing it apart. After a lot of effort, they finally managed to break off the core component of the machine. Staring at the heavy lead container in front of them, the two young men couldn't stop smiling, completely unaware that they had just opened Pandora's box with their own hands. Before long, the treasure was brought to a scrap collection station. The owner, Winnie, was a shrewd businessman. After some bargaining, they finally settled on a deal. $1,750 in cash, plus a 50 tip. At last, the two young men had the money they had been dreaming of. Enough to buy those soccer shoes. Winnie didn't know exactly what it was, but following routine, he instructed his employees to completely dismantle the metal can. Inside, beyond the heavy lead shell, lay a pile of strange powder. The moment the lights went out, a ghostly blue glow erupted in the darkness. Winnie was stunned. In decades of collecting scrap, he had never seen anything so dazzling. Seeing it as a priceless treasure, he took the blue powder straight home. 10 days passed, and the first signs of disaster began to appear. Winnie's wife started feeling constantly weak, and sometimes she even felt nauseous. At first, Winnie thought she had just eaten something bad. Anthony was a sensitive woman. Ever since her husband brought the glowing powder home, everyone who came into contact with it began falling ill. But Winnie was convinced this treasure would make him a fortune. After whispering a few words to comfort his wife, he turned and headed back to the scrapyard. The moment he left, Anthony sent her nephew to carry the glowing powder. Together, they boarded a crowded bus and spent 2 hours traveling to the city's health inspection office. She wanted the officials there to examine the powder and see if anything was wrong with it. 2 employees at the scrapyard, who had come into contact with it earlier, had already been hospitalized, and now even she was starting to feel unwell. But Director Hanio dismissed the toxic substance Anthony had brought, assuming it was probably just some spoiled food at home. As their argument escalated, Anthony grew paler and paler, worried that things might turn deadly. Hanio quickly led her outside for some fresh air. Trying to get her out of his office as fast as possible, he offered a half-hearted promise to examine the contents of the bag and urged Anthony to visit a nearby clinic immediately. Once they left, the bag was carelessly left in the yard like an unattended time bomb. Meanwhile, nuclear physicist Machio had just returned from Rio to celebrate his father's birthday. He and his girlfriend were still basking in the joy of expecting their first child, completely unaware that an unprecedented disaster was quietly spreading across the city. The family gathered around the dining table, discussing how to hold the birthday celebration. But a sudden phone call shattered Machio's plans. An old friend, a doctor, knew he specialized in nuclear physics and called to ask for advice. Lately, the doctor had been treating a large number of patients with the same symptoms: dizziness, vomiting, hair loss. He suspected radiation poisoning. One of his patients, named Anthony, insisted that the source of the illness was the metal object she had brought to the health inspection office. Driven by professional instinct, Machio agreed to help. He instructed Director Hanio at the health inspection office to borrow a radiation detector from the nuclear company, then return to the office to figure out a plan. But as soon as they reached the entrance, the detector blared a piercing alarm. Radiation levels had instantly spiked off the charts. Machio instinctively assumed the device was malfunctioning. After all, this small town couldn't possibly be experiencing such extreme radiation. But when they swapped in a new detector, the readings were exactly the same. Even before they could approach the office, the alarm went off again. Machio immediately realized something was seriously wrong. Hanio suddenly remembered the metal bag Anthony had abandoned in the yard yesterday. As they jumped out of the car, they saw a firefighter about to pick up the bag and throw it into the river. Machio ran forward, shouting at the top of his lungs for him to stop. This object was highly radioactive. If it went into the river, It could contaminate the entire water supply. Turning to Director Hanio, he demanded to know how such a basic mistake could happen. Had he never heard of the Chernobyl disaster? His words hit everyone present like a thunderclap. Without hesitation, Mashio ordered the immediate evacuation of the entire building. But even that wasn't enough. They needed to trace the source, figure out exactly where the metal object had come from. If any more contaminated material had spilled into the city, the consequences could be catastrophic. Hanio quickly pulled out the registration form Anthony had left behind, and the two of them followed the address to her husband's scrapyard. The radiation detector immediately showed dangerously high levels. The director worried, without protective gear, could they be exposed? Mashio used a campfire as an analogy. Radiation is like an invisible, cold flame. From a safe distance, it doesn't harm you. But once you get too close, it silently burns the skin and organs. At first, you might not feel anything, but over time, prolonged exposure will inevitably damage health, or even take a life. The severity depends on the strength and type of radiation, as well as the duration of exposure and distance from the source. When they finally confronted the scrapyard owner, Winnie, hoping to learn the origin of the metal object, he refused to cooperate. With a stern expression, he told them to leave immediately. He assumed Mashio was some kind of investigator, there to scrutinize the scrapyard, and his eyes were full of suspicion and hostility. Mashio had no choice but to patiently explain. This wasn't a criminal investigation. This was a life-or-death public health crisis. That glowing blue powder was highly toxic radioactive material. It could stick to clothing and skin, turning anyone who touched it into a walking source of contamination. If it wasn't contained quickly, countless residents could be exposed to dangerous radiation. Winnie's face turned ashen, just as he was about to speak. But one of his assistants jumped in first. He had overheard the two young men mention that the strange metal came from the abandoned radiation therapy center in Goyas. Mashio and Hanio didn't waste a second. They immediately drove to the therapy center. There, they quickly located the dismantled shell of the radiation machine. The missing core component was almost certainly the source of the radioactive contamination. Mashio immediately reported to the health minister, requesting that the entire block be quarantined and all exposed individuals receive treatment. The enraged minister nearly flipped the table. This situation was catastrophic, and he didn't even have the authority to take such drastic action. Not long after, the National Nuclear Energy Commission in Rio received a call from Mashio. After verification, they confirmed that the abandoned device at the therapy center did not contain cobalt as expected. Instead, it held cesium-137 in powder form, a far more radioactive substance, and one of the primary isotopes released during the Chernobyl disaster. Because of chaotic record-keeping, this device had never been officially registered, making it a forgotten dirty bomb. Meanwhile, Mashio was briefing the state governor on the severity of the situation. The radiation levels from the contamination source were astonishing, already beyond the capacity of standard measurement equipment. And since the cesium-137 existed as powder, it could silently adhere to any moving object, constantly expanding the range of contamination. At this point, it wasn't just about quarantining the block. Even infected patients in the hospital would need to be forcibly isolated. The governor nodded in resignation. Emergency measures were the only option. He hoped Mashio could stay and assist, since the small town lacked nuclear experts. The young physicist hesitated but agreed, mentioning that specialists from a nuclear commission would also arrive to provide support. As night fell, the state government deployed both military and police forces. They not only forced a full evacuation of the scrapyard, but also completely surrounded Winnie's family, leaving no way out. Luckily, his workers had nowhere else to go and were all gathered together in one place. Mashio pulled out his radiation detector and warned bluntly. This area was already contaminated. If they stayed any longer, they would face the same life-threatening risk as his wife. Winnie had wanted to resist to hold out to the end, but when he turned and saw his wife and children, his resolve instantly melted. In the end, Winnie, his family, and a few of his employees boarded a sealed transport vehicle. Soon, they arrived at the city's central stadium, which had been temporarily converted into an isolation center to house potential and suspected radiation victims. Meanwhile, television news channels began reporting the shocking radioactive incident. Mashio's father and wife immediately turned pale as they watched the coverage. By midnight, Dr. Ben from a nuclear commission arrived at the isolation stadium. He praised Mascio for decisively implementing quarantine measures despite the lack of proper equipment. But the most severe challenges were still yet to come. Dr. Ben arrived at the regulatory office where the contamination source was located. Before any countermeasures could be planned, he needed to determine the exact radiation levels. But when Dr. Ben used his more advanced detection equipment, the readings once again shot off the charts. It was clear the contamination was far worse than anyone had imagined. The governor instinctively wanted to move the metal object, but Dr. Ben immediately vetoed the idea. Moving it recklessly could trigger secondary contamination, and obtaining a specialized lead container wasn't feasible at the moment. Instead, Dr. Ben proposed a temporary solution. Encase the metal object in a cement pipe, then pour concrete over it to form a makeshift stone coffin. This would both block the radiation and prevent the cesium powder from spreading. Once the governor left to carry out the plan, Dr. Ben felt his head buzzing with the enormity of the task ahead. Not only did they need to treat the exposed victims, but they also had to cut off the source of contamination. With the personnel on hand, that alone was far from enough. Dr. Ben immediately decided to dispatch a team of experts to provide support. Dr. Ben was deeply impressed by Mascio's sense of responsibility and expertise, and even personally checked him for contamination. To his alarm, he discovered that Mascio's shoes, and even the soles of his feet, were covered in radioactive powder. This substance was like a ghostly killer, striking silently when people were least prepared. Back at home, Mascio immediately stripped off all his clothes. He didn't exchange pleasantries with his father or wife. Instead, he rushed to the bathroom to thoroughly wash his body. As a physics doctor, Mascio knew that an unprecedented and massive challenge was about to unfold. Meanwhile, far away in Vienna, the chairman of the Nuclear Energy Commission received an urgent call.
César, se a gente não agir rápido, a gente vai ter desastre como o Brasil nunca viu.
In the darkness, the people quarantined inside the stadium began to sing nursery rhymes. The songs were innocent, yet filled with sadness. They had no idea what fate awaited them. And that concludes episode 1 of Emergencia Radioactiva. This series is based on real events. While it doesn't feature spectacular disaster scenes, it vividly captures the spread of ignorance and the fear of the invisible, especially the haunting blue glow of the radioactive powder. It makes you feel the terror lurking behind everyday calm. That's all for today's recap. If you enjoyed it, be sure to stay tuned for the next episode.